It's the day of death today, with all 4 factions getting their full faction packs released, so we can see all of the new rules, formations, spells, and war scrolls for the followers of Nagash. And starting off with the ghosts, this video is going to be a full faction pack review for the Nighthaunt. Like the Blades of Khorne yesterday, we will go a bit quicker over some of the bits that we've seen in the faction focus articles, but this is going to be a fairly long video taking a look at all of the new spells and abilities in the faction pack and seeing which of the units look like they may well be staples going into AOS 4.0. As with the Blades of Khorne, we have already seen the battle traits, so we won't dwell on them too much, but they are very good indeed. Ethereal is still giving you that ignore rend, which is mostly useful. It can be a bit of a pain if you wanted to use all-out defense or something because you can't, but that is of course helped to a very great degree with our unique reaction ability, which is called Discorporate. And this bumps our native army-wide 6-up ward save to 5-up, and is quite often actually a little bit better than just getting +1 to your armor saves. It does mean, all told, that a lot of our units can end up with a 4-up unrendable save and then a 5-up ward, which is really solid durability, all things considered. We also still get our Wave of Terror abilities back in the form of 3 separate Aura of Dread rules. They are Shriek, Stun, and Petrify. These are now done once per turn and affect a certain unit rather than just affecting anything, and you no longer have to be reliant on a particular dice roll on your charges. So Shriek can be done by any Nighthaunt unit and affects an enemy unit that has less models than yours, and they get -1 to their hit rolls. Stun is done by a War Machine or a Cavalry unit and makes an enemy -1 to their saving rolls, whilst Petrify is done by a hero and forces Strike Last on a unit. Now, these abilities are done once per turn in your charge phase, but the actual Wave of Terror rule itself lets you use charge abilities even if you are in combat, so you can still get these 3 rules off onto an enemy, even if you are already locked into combat with them, which is quite nice. Overall, it's a great set of traits that make it very easy to still debuff a few enemy units across the board and still mean that your ghosts will be quite resilient, especially against high rend enemy attacks. But onto the new stuff, the formations, and again we get 4, and these are all quite cool, although for me one of them is the standout one. Ethereal Translocation is just a nice simple move a unit around. This is the Vanishing Phantasms formation, and it means that you pick a unit in your movement phase and you can pick it up and put it back down on the board 9 inches from enemies. So you can quickly move to grab an objective or get out of the way of a potential incoming charge from a scary enemy unit in their next turn, or just bait an enemy with your general and then move them to the complete opposite end of the board. It is very, very useful, and it means your army is going to be incredibly fast and incredibly slippery. Hunters of the Accursed gives you the rule of Vengeful Malison. This lets you pick up to 3 enemy heroes within 12 inches of a Nighthaunt hero at the end of any turn, and you roll a d3, and on a 2+ you do that much mortal damage to them. It is again quite potent, potentially letting you get up to 9 mortal damage across 3 enemy heroes, which is rather tasty, but I would say it's probably the hardest of the formations to set up. Getting enemy heroes within range of your heroes may not be super tricky, but getting 3 in range might be, and it also does of course mean you are putting your heroes very much in harm's way. So this does have the potential to be good, but I think it requires a bit more thought and setup and risk than the other options. Deathstalkers is the one we saw in the faction focus, and There Is No Escape is the rule for this. I think this one is probably my favourite. It lets your Nighthaunt units also charge after they have run or they have retreated, and also when you do retreat, you don't take any mortal damage for doing so. So this just makes you super difficult to pin down, you can get out of scary combats you don't want to be in, and of course army-wide run and charge means most of your units are now going to be moving between 9 and 14 inches in the movement phase, and can still charge after that, which gives you a really significant threat radius with pretty much your entire army. Finally, we have the Procession of Death. This is all about your black coaches. The rule is Cavalcade of Death, and very simply gives all Nighthaunt infantry units a 5-up ward save if they are wholly within 6 inches of a black coach. This is just crazy good. If you have a couple of coaches supporting a few blobs of infantry moving up together, you are pretty much going to have an almost army-wide 4-up save, 5-up ward on your units, which is disgustingly resilient, excuse the Nurgle pun there. It means that against 100 attacks that hit and wound on 3s, about 14 will actually get through to do any damage, so it really does boost your survivability a lot. It does require you, of course, to take black coaches, so that might put you off, but as we will see, black coaches aren't bad units in and of themselves, and if you love the models, and why wouldn't you, they look fantastic, this formation does give you a really good incentive to bring a few of them. Up next, we have the heroic traits and artifacts. The traits are quite interesting, with Ruler of the Spectral Hosts letting you bring a unit back at half strength once per battle in your movement phase. Now this could be really strong if you have, say, a unit of 20 Reapers or Revenants that got killed. You can then bring back 10 of them, essentially making this a guaranteed bonus 150 odd points or so depending on the unit, so it's very useful. It is only once per game, of course, but 10 extra Revenants or Haridans or whatever could definitely swing a combat or a game in your favour. Cloaked in Shadow is fine. It means you can't be hit on less than a 4+. Unmodified rolls of 1 to 3 always fail. It is solid, and it means your heroes are going to be that bit more tanky, needing 4s to be hit, and then of course having their 4-up ethereal save. But even then, most of our heroes aren't super tanky or great in combat anyway, so it's not really where you want them. None of the Nighthaunt heroes, apart from maybe the Lord Executioner, are really frontline bruisers, so this is arguably just improving something that you kind of want to just try and avoid on most of your heroes anyway, so whether it's actually going to be all that useful is kind of dubious, I think. The final choice is Terrifying Entity. This lets your hero use an extra Aura of Dread ability up to a maximum of 2. So potentially, if your hero was a Knight of Shrouds on Steed, so they were a cavalry unit, they could use both Stun and Petrify and inflict both Strike Last and -1 to saves onto an enemy unit, so that's fairly useful and fairly unpleasant to put onto an enemy. I think overall, the Ruler of the Spectral Hosts might be the best in general, with Terrifying Entity being a reasonable pick, and then Cloaked in Shadow being still useful, but probably my least favourite of the 3. In terms of artifacts, we keep some old favourites with the Soulfire Ring and the Light Shard of the Harvest. The Light Shard still gives you +1 attack to all melee weapons for friendly Nighthaunt units wholly within 12 inches of your hero for a turn. It is once per battle, but again, one turn of having those extra 10 or 20 attacks from a big unit of Revenants could be all the difference you need to win a game. Covetous Familiar is a reaction that you use when your opponent declares a fight ability, and when they do, you roll a d3, and on a 2+ on the roll, you inflict that much mortal damage to the enemy, so it's basically a way to punish enemies that are fighting near your hero. It's not a huge amount of damage, but I mean, I guess over a game it could add up. You could definitely kill off a few infantry models or a squishy hero model over the course of a few rounds, so it could be useful as the game goes on. And then finally, we have the Soulfire Ring. This is a simple heal. If your hero kills any models with combat attacks, then at the end of any turn, you can heal d6. So this is great for keeping some of your more combat-focused heroes alive. It might be worth it if you have a Lord Executioner and you want them in combat a bit more, but you want them to stay alive as much as possible. Using this, and then potentially the Cloaked in Shadow to make them more durable on top of that, could be a reasonable combo to have on something like a Lord Executioner, I guess. Unlike Khorne, we do of course get a spell lore for the Nighthaunt, and it is very good. The Lore of the Underworlds has some absolute bangers in it. Spirit Drain is cast on a 7 and it lets you pick an enemy unit within 18 inches and you roll a dice equal to the number of models in the unit, and on a 5+ they take 1 mortal damage. So this is your basic anti-horde chaff clearing spell. It is simple, it's effective, and things like zombies will absolutely hate it. Spectral Law is cast on a 6 and it gives you some much needed recursion in your army. You pick a Nighthaunt unit wholly within 12 inches of the caster and you can return up to d6 health worth of models. So up to 6 1 health models or potentially up to 3 2 health models, for instance. It is quite useful for keeping your bigger squads trucking as long as possible, and I think this will be a very viable pick for someone to be casting pretty much every magic phase. The final spell might be my favourite. This is Shade Mist, and again this plays heavily into your durability. You cast it on a 6 and it affects a friendly unit with 3 or more models that is within 12 inches of the caster, and they get -1 to be wounded until your next turn. So now your unit of ghosts can potentially be on a 4+ unrendable save with a 5+ ward save, and then also be -1 to be wounded, which is crazy tanky. It's also an unlimited spell, so it can be cast multiple times, so you can actually get multiple units in your army much more resistant to enemy attacks for a turn, and I just think in general, this whole lore is great. All 3 spells are useful, they are powerful, and they're all really fun to use as well. The manifestations for the Nighthaunt again will feature towards the end of the video in the Warscroll section, but we still have the Mortalis Nexus, the Shaiish Reaper and the Vault of Souls. They're all cast on a 6 and they're set up either 9 inches or 12 inches from the caster, but as I said, we will take a look at their individual rules in just a little bit. And so onto the Warscrolls themselves. As I said, we have seen a few already, so I will skim over those slightly, and Nagash is one that we have already seen. I did do a fairly in-depth video of his Warscroll when they showed it off a little while ago. He is uniquely keyworded to each death faction now, which is fantastic and means it's much easier for him to get the unique benefits from each death army. Now he doesn't get ethereal, which is a shame, but with 18 wounds, a 3+ save, a 5+ ward, and being a 9 cast wizard, he is absolutely fantastic. He is expensive, of course. He costs 880 points, which is a lot, but it's also not 1,000 points, which he has been in the past, so small graces, I guess. And then being Nighthaunt keyworded, he can obviously cast the spells from the lore of the underworlds, and as far as I'm aware, it also means that things like the formations work on him. So he can, for instance, charge after he's run in the Deathstalkers formation, or teleport around the board with ethereal translocation, which is super strong for him. And I actually think with how they've done it, with him having those unique keywords for each death faction, he's quite a bit better than he has ever been before. And I genuinely can't wait to take him for a spin in my Nighthaunt, just to see what he can do in this edition. Lady Alinda also makes a welcome return, although at a new and pricier 300 points. She has 7 health and still has her great 4+ unrendable save and 4+ ward save combo, giving her effectively 28 health against regular non-mortal damage. She can move 8 and has a control of 2, and in melee she is okay. She's lost a few attacks as we saw in the faction focus, but she still has 10 auto-wounding attacks in total, 4 of which are D3 damage. Her Horrifying Visage is now a proper shooting attack rather than just being a D6 roll, so it's slightly worse, but it does still hit and wound on 2s with a whopping 3 rend, so it's still a solid attack in and of itself. Her main kind of rules and abilities are reducing enemy control scores with a Mortarch of Grief, which is great for pushing enemy units off objectives, and then she also gives you yet more recursion with her once per battle ability, No Rest for the Wicked, which returns D3 + 3 health worth of models to any number of Nighthaunt units on the battlefield. And it's just worth noting quickly here that these healing abilities we've seen so far, they aren't heals per se. You can't use this to heal Nagash D3 + 3 health, for instance. It just returns that many health's worth of models. So it brings stuff back, doesn't actually heal stuff up. So that's just a small clarification to make there. In terms of new Warscrolls we haven't seen yet, the Grumpy Guts Curvus Valia has also come back. He is now 200 points, but he is still an absolute bruiser. He's got 7 health, a 4-up save, a 6-up ward, and an 8-inch move. He's got 6 attacks that are kind of meh, they're his spectral attacks, but his scepter, which is his main attacks, they are 4 and they hit and wound on 3s with 2 rend and a flat 3 damage, and then they also wound on crits. So he can do a lot of work. He will kill off around 5 4-up save, 1 health infantry just with his scepter quite reliably, and he also still impacts enemy command points with the "if I cannot rule, none shall." This is a once per turn reaction, and it's done when your opponent declares a command for a unit within 12 inches of Kurdos. You roll a dice, and on a 3+, the opponent has to spend 1 additional command point to use the command, but also the command has no effect. So not only does it cost them more, it still doesn't do anything, and they lose both of those command points. So this is hilariously good in an edition where command points are much, much rarer. Wasting 2 of your opponent's command points is super, super strong. And whilst he is pricey, this ability is so powerful and impactful. On top of his very good melee profile, I would say he's actually a reasonable pick now. Allra the Drowner is one of the newer Nighthaunt models and still brings some impressive movement trickery. He's not awful in melee, but he's not exactly great. He's got 4 attacks that hit on 4s, wound on 3s with 2 rend and d3 damage. He still has auto wounds on crits, so he's not the worst, but he's definitely not a melee powerhouse. His main use is Passage Through the Underworlds, which gives you a once per turn move in your movement phase, where he and a friendly unit wholly within 12 inches can be removed, and then they are reset up 6 inches from each other and 7 inches away from enemies. Now, neither Allra or the unit you choose can be in combat to do this, but this lets you move him and, say, a unit of Revenants 7 inches away from enemies, which means you are getting a much easier charge in your subsequent charge phase. Now, a 7-inch charge is by no means guaranteed, of course, but it is much more reliable than a 9-inch charge, and it can help you get off an early game charge with a scary unit of ghosts, and if nothing else, this will allow you to put a lot of pressure onto your opponent's battle lines and onto their game plan. This is pretty much all he does, and at 160 points he is a bit pricey, but if you want to make use of that movement ability and get a cheeky early game charge in, he could well be worth that cost. Reikenor we saw in the faction focus, and I still think he's fantastic. He has gone up to a fairly hefty 210 points, which is an increase of 50 points from 3rd edition, but he's got a great amount of attacks and can do a load of 3 damage swings into enemies. He's still a great anti-wizard or anti-priest piece, getting +1 to hit and wound against them. He's still one of our more reliable casters, being able to get +1 to cast and also potentially boosting himself to a 2-cast wizard with your corpse candles. And in 4th edition, having a 2-cast wizard is a really impactful thing to have in your army. So he's just great. I really love him. Everything about his war scroll is really strong. And I think despite his now increased price tag, I can see a lot of people trying to fit him into their armies just from the sheer usefulness of his kind of everything that he can do, whether it be melee combat or spellcasting or just his great movement. On to the non-named heroes now. The scripter Mortis, who used to be very much a big joke in the Nighthaunt book, is now actually okay, I guess. He has had a whopping 60-point increase up to 140 points, and he is still 6 health with the standard 4-up ethereal save. He does have some crappy melee attacks with his quill that aren't worth talking about, but the main reason you would take him is his Sentenced to Eternal Torment ability, which is once per turn and lets you pick an enemy unit within 18 inches, and you roll a dice, and on a 3+, they are sentenced for the rest of the battle. Now, at the end of your turns, you can roll for each sentenced unit on the battlefield, and on a 4+, you inflict a number of mortal damage equal to the battle round. So this has the potential to be really nasty. You could, in theory, get up to 3 or 4 units sentenced by the end of the game, and by that point, you could be throwing out anything from 12 to 16 mortal damage onto those enemy units if you did manage to get 4 units sentenced and it was your turn 4. I mean, it is unlikely because it only goes off on a 4+ and you need to be within 18 inches to sentence a unit and roll a 3+ to actually sentence them. So that is very unlikely, but the potential is there. For me, he's still just way, way, way too swingy to consider though, but I do think he's got a lot better than he was, and he is much more likely to at least do some damage and maybe be a threat to squishier heroes over the course of the game compared to his old 3rd edition Warscroll though. The old Warhammer Fantasy Tomb Banshee is still kicking, although not really because she has no legs, but she's still floating. She has also seen a huge increase from 80 points to 150. She can do some okay shooting at 12 inches with D3 shots that hit on 4s, wound on 3s, with 2 rend, which is nice, and D3 damage, so that's okay. In melee, she's got the same profile, it's just a guaranteed 3 attacks rather than D3. She also gives you a nice passive which lets you ignore any positive modifiers to enemy control scores if they are within 12 inches of her, and she is wholly within 12 inches of any Mirmorn Banshees. So her running around with some of the Banshees could be a decent way to stop your opponent from taking objectives quite as easily. But then she also has a good ability in Ghostly Howl. This is done in any shooting phase, and you pick an enemy unit that has been damaged this turn by your Piercing Scream, so her shooting ability, and on a 2+, they can't use any commands until your next turn. So this could be a decent way to debuff an enemy unit and stop them having any commands on them, but it does rely on her doing damage, which, I mean, it's not that unlikely with the Scream profile, but at the same time, it's only D3 shots and only hitting on 4s. So again, you can't guarantee it. So again, this is a bit too swingy for my liking, especially at 150 points. Both the Knight of Shrouds and the version on his Ethereal Steed get a points bump. The regular one goes up 40 points to 140, and the mounted version goes up 60 points to 180, which is quite painful. The regular Knight is still 5 health and has 5 attacks, but they only hit on 4s now rather than 3s, which sucks. He can still steal people's time with his Stolen Hours rule. This doesn't give him any bonus wounds anymore, it is just a heal now, but it is a slightly better heal because instead of just being 1 health that he gets back now, it's based on how much damage he's inflicted. So if he was on 1 health remaining and he did 4 points of damage, he could get back up to full wounds. And then he also has a new reaction called Infantry Overseer. This is done after you've declared a fight ability for this unit, and you can pick a friendly Nighthaunt infantry unit that hasn't fought and is within combat range of your Knight of Shrouds, and they can immediately fight after this guy, and when they do, they get +1 to hit. So it's kind of like the Bloodmaster for the Bloodletters in Khorne. He fights, then he picks an infantry unit to fight straight after him, and they get a little buff for doing so. He's not bad, but being 140 points, I think is quite a lot for what he does. The mounted version is basically exactly the same, except he has 7 health now, which is a slight improvement, along with 3 extra attacks from his horse, and then his reaction is called Cavalry Overseer, which, as you might guess, lets a unit fight immediately after him, but this time it has to be cavalry or a war machine. So basically your Hex Rays or a Black Coach or your Dreadblade Harrows, and they also get that +1 to hit bonus when they do fight after him. Also returning from the worlds of fantasy is the Cairn Wraith, with still one of the absolute coolest models in the entire range. This bad boy has bumped up 40 points to 130, and he has had a significant change to his attack profile. He no longer does as many attacks as there are enemies within 3 inches, so no more 20 odd attacks against 25mm bases. Instead, he just has 6 attacks base that hit on 4s, wound on 3s with 1 rend and 2 damage. So he is definitely less killy than he was before, especially against big hordes, but he does now get a rather nice buff for Grimghast Reapers. And his Eager Death Dealers rule means that when he is in combat, if you have a unit of Reapers wholly within 12 inches of him, they get +1 attack. So if he's charged in with a unit of Grimghast Reapers, they can get +1 attack from him, and then if you have the Light Shard of the Harvest Moon on him because he is a hero, they could potentially be +2 attacks for a turn, which does turn them into fairly scary blenders. So there is some nice synergy there if you did want to lean into it. Old favourites such as the Crol Gascruciat take a very sad hit. However, in return, this guy does actually drop 10 points, going down from 160 to 150. But whilst that sounds like good news, he's lost a lot. He's still got the same mediocre ranged attacks, and his melee attacks are now the same, but they only hit on 4s rather than 3s, so he's less good from that perspective. But the main nerf to him is that he doesn't give his old -1 to incoming damage debuff anymore for friendly units that are wholly within 12 inches of him, which is basically why he was an auto take in 3rd edition. Now, his empowered through excruciation just lets you ignore the first point of damage that is allocated to each Nighthaunt unit wholly within 12 inches each phase. So it's much less impressive. It can still cover a fair few units with that 12-inch aura, and it definitely will still help your survivability, especially if you are going up against 1 damage attacks. But overall, I would say it's much worse, and it does in particular make you much more vulnerable to things like charging cavalry that, from what we've seen in the most part, get bonus damage on the charge. So going up to 3 damage instead of 2 or 2 damage instead of 1, that obviously is much more impactful with this new version of the Cruciator compared to how it would have been in 3rd. On the flip side, the Lord Executioner I think has actually got a bit better. He's gone up 30 points, which isn't a huge amount really, and he is still very capable in melee with 5 attacks that hit on wound on 3s. They are 2 rend, they're 2 damage, but they are now +1 rend against heroes, so he is now a very good character assassin. He's able to put about 4 or so damage onto an enemy 3-up save unit quite reliably. He also gets an improved, in my opinion, version of Staring Death in the Face. This now reduces 1 from the attacks characteristic of a melee weapon for a target unit instead of making them -1 to wound. Now, removing attacks I think is always a little bit better overall than making them hit or wound worse, although this no longer goes off automatically. You have to roll and it goes off on a 2+. So it is a little bit less reliable, but I think generally it's a bit better in terms of what the debuff actually does. On top of that, if you do this ability on an enemy hero, it also subtracts 5 from their control score. So you can potentially either massively debuff something like a big unit of knights, reducing their incoming attacks by a lot, or if you are up against a hero with a good control score, you can go into them, massively reduce their control by 5, and also still make them a little bit worse by dropping their attacks. Yes, it's only going to be by 1, and they may have multiple attacks on their characteristic, but it's still a useful debuff to give, whether you are going into a single individual hero character or a big unit of knights or infantry or whatever. He still has his 5-up ward, which is really great on him, and I just think overall he has come out of this looking slightly better in 4th edition than he did in 3rd. We saw the Dreadblade Harrows in the faction focus. These guys are now a unit, which is great, and they can be reinforced up to 4 strong. They are, however, 160 points for 2, so they are 80 points each, and with only 3 health and a 4-up save and a 6-up ward, that's not amazing, but their main power is their Phantasmal Discorporation, which lets them move around the board and set up 9 inches away from enemies, but it's in any movement phase. So you can just up and move them away from enemy charges or onto a faraway backfield objective that your opponent has just moved away from and they thought was safe. They are just super good utility pieces, and also they're quite good buffing units too. If they charge in, then a friendly Nighthaunt unit gets +3 to their control score if it is wholly within 12 inches of this unit. So, alongside a unit of Reapers or Chain Rasps, you can much more easily steal an objective from the enemy by charging these guys in alongside your unit. Our main non-named wizard, the Guardian of Souls, has also seen a small point drop to 140 points, mainly because his spectral lore is now part of the faction spells rather than on his war scroll, is what I would argue. He again moves to 4s to hit rather than 3s, and is still a 1-cast wizard, and still gives that +1 to wound for friendly Nighthaunt units wholly within 12 inches, thanks to his Nightmare Lantern. He's definitely less of an auto-take in some ways, now that Spectral Lure can be cast by Reikenor or Alinda, but on the other hand, he is still our only other wizard, so you will absolutely still be taking at least one, and you will probably just be using him to cast Spectral Lure. So he's essentially the same as he was before, he's just 10 points cheaper, and he hits slightly worse, but I do think you will still see him, at least one, in most army lists. Moving on to some of the actual units now, and the first off the block is the new Pyregeists. These have gotten worse in their shooting, with only 2 shots each rather than 3. They are still 4s and 4s, 1 rend and 1 damage, but they have also had a huge points drop. They've gone from 170 all the way down to 130, which is very welcome indeed. Their Warscroll rule of Lighter Pyre still interacts with objectives, doing mortal damage on a 2+ on a d3 roll to an enemy unit within 6 inches if your unit is contesting an objective. Crucially, the enemy unit doesn't need to be contesting it, they just need to be within 6 inches of these guys when they are. And then on top of that, you also add that number of the d3 roll to this unit's control score for the turn, which does actually make them quite sneaky little objective grabbers. The Spirit Torment is still your recursion hero. It's 5 health with a 4-up save and the same attack profile, now hitting on 4s, but now instead of just returning 3 health worth of models at the end of each combat phase, he now lets you roll 3 extra dice when you use a rally command on a unit wholly within 12 inches of him. So it's still a nice, if slightly less reliable as it's not guaranteed anymore, way to bring some models back to a unit. He is still quite cheap, having only gone up 10 points to 130, so I think he is still very much worth bringing just to get you some more models back as the game goes on. In terms of some of our other main melee units, the Grimghast Reapers, as mentioned, combo very well with the Cairn Wraith. They've dropped 10 points to 140, so they are 14 points per model now, and they have the same 2 attacks that hit on 4s, wound on 3s, with 1 rend and 1 damage. They are, however, rend 2 against infantry now, which is great, and Reaped Like Corn now gives them crits on 5s against a unit with 5 or more models rather than +1 attack. So there's slightly less reliability there, but potentially you can spike higher. And then of course, with the bonus attacks from the Cairn Wraiths and possibly the Light Shard, you could be seeing 40 attacks from 10 of these guys exploding on 5s, which is quite scary for their cost. Chain Ghasts go up to 3 health each instead of 2, which for a 10-point increase is actually rather nice. They are only control 1 and they can't be reinforced, and they are also now less reliable with their another link in the chain rule. Instead of just giving +1 to hit for Nighthaunt units wholly within 12 inches, now you have to roll and you need to roll a 3+, but you get +1 to the roll if they are within 12 inches of a Spirit Torment. So they have more health, but their buff is less reliable. The good thing about it is that it doesn't need a Spirit Torment to be alive anymore. The 3rd edition version needed the Torment to be on the battlefield for the buff to go off. Now they can always roll for it and try it, it's just that they need that 3+ to get it off, and if there is no Spirit Torment or it's being killed, they don't get that +1 to get it down to a 2+. So for 100 points, they can still be useful. They've got a bit of extra health and they do still give you that +1 to hit bonus. It just can potentially be a little bit less reliable in terms of getting it off. Our most humble unit of the Chain Rasps are up next. They are still 100 points for 10. They're still pretty awful with our only 5-up save in the army instead of a 4-up. And they have 2 attacks that now wound on 5s rather than 4s. So yeah, they're kind of bad. They do get +1 to wound on a turn they've charged, but it's still fairly awful. Even 20 of them on the charge will only do around 5 damage to a 4-up save, which for 200 points, you could definitely spend better elsewhere. For instance, on most of a black coach. The black coach stays at 260 points, and as we've seen, it does have a lot of synergy in this army now, especially in its own battle formation. The coach itself is still 12 health with a 4-up save. It does only get a 6-up ward now instead of the 5-up, which is a shame, but it still gets a bucket load of attacks, 5 at rend 2, damage 2, and then another 14 that are 1 damage, but all of which can auto wound on crits, so it can still do a hell of a lot of work. It's still super mobile, with Nimbus of Power letting you remove it and then set it up again 9 inches from enemies in your movement phase. It still does impact hits when you charge, doing 2 or 3 mortal damage if you roll a 2+ on a d3. And then Evocation of Death is still around, but it has changed. Now it lets you return a slain, non-unique Nighthaunt hero at the end of any turn. So if this unit has destroyed any enemy units, you can bring one of your slain heroes back 12 inches away from your black coach, and they can be set up in combat, but only with enemy units that are already in combat with your coach. So this is just really good. You could charge into an enemy hero and a squad of infantry, do some mortals as you charge in, kill the enemy hero, and then bring one of your own dead heroes back at the end of the turn in combat with that infantry squad, ready to fight in the next turn's fight phase. And then of course, another benefit of the black coach is if you are in their own formation, you bring that 5-up ward save to nearby infantry. It's just really good. It's fast, it's mobile, it's got some token shooting and some solid melee damage. The only downside about it is that it doesn't do the explosion of mortal damage anymore, but bringing slain heroes back does make up for that, I think, and I do genuinely think these things will see a lot of play in the new book. Our shooty boys, the Craven Throne Guard, get a modest points bump up to 100 points for 5, so they are 20 points per model, but they are actually quite decent at shooting now, which is weird. They're 2 attacks that hit on 4s, but they now wound on 3s, and they are still 1 rend, but also have got an improvement to 16 inches of range. So they are much more of a threat now, and they can still shoot at enemies that aren't visible thanks to their spectral bolts. So you can genuinely make a case for these guys, I think, which is really weird. I never thought I would say that, but crossbows may be back, baby. Up next we have my personal favourite unit in the army, the Bladegeist Revenants. They drop 1 point per model to 150 for 5, and although they aren't quite as amazing anymore because they don't get that great interaction from the Scarlet Doom, they are still very good blenders. They have 2 attacks that hit and wound on 3s with 1 rend, and they are 1 damage, and they get +1 attack on the charge. So they are still wickedly good in melee, they are super fast, and I think they will still be a very, very popular pick as the main infantry style unit for a lot of Nighthaunt armies. Glaive Wraith Stalkers also still exist, weirdly. They're still odd. 80 points for 4 of them, with 2 attacks that hit on 4s, wound on 3s, with 1 rend, and they are now only 1 damage, so they're not always 2 damage anymore, they're just +1 damage on the charge, so that is worse. They can choose an enemy unit in deployment, and that is their stalked target. And whenever you declare a charge with this unit, if the stalked unit is within 12 inches of your Glaive Wraiths, they get +2 to their charge rolls, but they have to end in combat with the stalked unit. So essentially, it's +2 to charge your stalked target unit. I just think they're weird. If they came in squads of 5 and could be reinforced to 10, then maybe that would be nice. I just think it's weird to have a 4-strong unit that still can't really do much. It's basically 20 points for a 1 health model that has 2 attacks that only hit on 4s. It's just, they never do much, and they're just still really quite bad. The Banshees, again, we saw in the faction focus, so I won't go into them too much detail, but they still can do some solid work. They are now 2 health each, which is fantastic for their durability. They can still unbind if the target of a spell is within 12 inches of them, which is really solid. I still think they're going to be a great pick. They have gone up 30 points to 120 for 4 of them, but they are still going to be almost mandatory for some extra magical defense in your army, especially if your meta is going to have a lot of wizards in it. Spirit Hosts stay the same, 130 points, but they get an interesting change to their mechanic. Now, instead of letting a hero pass off damage onto them, they just give friendly heroes a 4-up ward save when they are within combat range of the Spirit Hosts. So things like your Knight of Shrouds or your Lord Executioners will get a 4-up ward and be a lot more durable when they are near to some Spirit Hosts. I personally think it's a better change overall. It might be less good mathematically slightly, but it's just easier and it requires less bookkeeping and thinking about the whole rolling to pass off damage. It's just, I'm a fan of it, and I think Spirit Hosts will still be quite worthwhile and popular to protect those squishier foot heroes. One of the big competitors for the Revenants is the Dreadside Haridans. These ladies are also 150 points, but they have 1 extra attack base, but they only hit and wound on 4s. They do, however, get +1 to hit and +1 to wound if they are in combat with a damaged enemy or a unit that's had any models slain that turn, so they can basically turn into Revenants in terms of their hit and their wound roll. It just requires a little bit more setup. They can also force -1 to wound on enemy units that they've charged with their Harrowing Shriek, so they can actually end up being slightly better than Revenants overall if you get everything set up for them. I think it's just a bit trickier to get it all, like all your ducks in a row. So it depends how much you want to go into kind of the techie style of gameplay. If you just want something straightforward where you can just move up, charge, get in, get all those attacks hitting and wounding on 3s, then maybe the Revenants. If you want something that is a bit more techie where you have to do some damage before charging these ladies in to get to that same level, but then also get the bonus of the -1 to wound, then Haridans may be better. They are, if everything lines up and both units get the absolute most buffs they can, the Haridans will be slightly more optimal, but it just takes a little bit more to get them to there. So both are good, both are very reliable picks for a lot of damage and some good usability. It just depends what you want to bring, how much kind of thought you want to put into your game plan, and also what you like the look of. The last unit before we get to the manifestations is the Hex Rays. They've gone up to 3 health each, which is great, and they've also dropped 10 points down to 160. They can no longer double move with Phantasmal Advance though, which is a big hit. One of their big key uses was getting a really big 24-inch move turn 1, but they do keep Spectral Hunters, which lets them roll a d3 and do that much mortal damage on a 2+, and then their Scythes, they only hit and wound on 4s now rather than 3s, but they gain +1 damage on the charge. So in the grand scheme of things, they do the same amount of damage overall when you math it all out, but they can of course spike it a bit higher now if you do roll well, which is nice. And then finally we have the 3 manifestations. The Mortalis Nexus lets you pick a friendly unit within 3 inches of it, and you can roll a dice, and on a 2+, you can either add +1 to run and charge rolls for the turn, or you can heal 3. Now this is actually really solid because you can either get into combat much more reliably, or you can actually heal. Not just return models like all the other healers we've seen in this army, but actually heal. So if Nagash is injured, this can actually bring him some health back. It's one of the very few ways we have in this army to heal rather than just return slain models. So this is a very, very useful piece, I think. The Vault of Souls still absorbs souls from models that are slain within 12 inches of it. It's either friendly or enemy, which is nice. And then when it's gathered up to 6 souls, you can pick any number of enemy units within 6 inches of it, and you roll a dice for each of those units, and on a 3+, they take that much mortal damage. So if you get this in a nice bunched up group of enemies, it could do quite a lot of work. A minimum of 3 mortal damage to each of the units you choose, because of course on a 1 or a 2 it does nothing, it only goes off on a 3+, so it will be potentially 3 to 6 mortal damage on a few scattered around enemy units, so it can be quite tasty. And then finally we have the Shyish Reaper. This can move 8, it's got a really good melee profile with 3s to hit, 2s to wound, 2 rend and 4 damage. The big downside is it's only 1 attack, but it is a really solid profile. But when this thing charges, you get +2 attacks. So on the charge, it's going to have 3 attacks, 3s to hit, 2s to wound, 2 rend, 4 damage each. So it can be doing up to 12 damage to an enemy, which is really, really good. All in all, I think the Nighthaunt seem very good. I love their battle traits. I love all of their formations, really. They're all good in their own way, even if I do think 1 or 2 of them are potentially better. I think they seem really fast, super mobile. They've got some solid casting in their lore. Their melee hitting power is overall pretty good. They do lack shooting, to be sure, and I also think that their heroes are very pricey for what some of them bring. I think it's generally going to be the case that some of your units, in terms of like your infantry units, your squads of units, are a little bit cheaper or the same as they were in third, which is going to help make up to some degree for the hefty increases that we've seen in the heroes. But you will, despite that, probably have not quite as much and certainly not as many heroes as you may have run in 3rd edition, where the army was quite hero heavy. But I still think that the generic makeup of the army is going to be a few main heroes supported by a couple of big blobs of fast moving ghosts, and that is going to be an extremely fun and potentially very, very powerful way to play the army. But as always, what do you make of these rules? Let me know all of your thoughts and ideas for any army lists down in the comments below. And as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do like and subscribe for more Warhammer content from me. But until next time, I'll catch you later, guys.